Hi folks, David Jameson here, editor of conter.co.uk. Just back to discuss more of the fallout from the US elections, but perhaps with a bit more of a focus now on the impact on Scotland, on Britain, and on the world system in general, the wider political implications of Biden's victory. Trump now, he hasn't conceded yet, but it's basically a foregone conclusion that Biden will be becoming president in January next year. Not that Trump holding out doesn't have its own implications. But Jonathon Shafi joins me to talk, a member of the editorial board of Conter, I should say, joins me to discuss the wider political implications. So I suppose when Trump came in 2016, the concern of many on the left, and I think this was borne out in many ways, was that he would be, from the position of the most powerful politician in the world, a global figurehead for a new right-wing, nationalist, chauvinistic right, and he would legitimize that politics and act as a kind of global focus for that political orientation. What does Biden spell in terms of his wider political ramifications? Because it is the case that when politics changes in the United States, though of course there are national peculiarities in every country, that does to an extent set the tone for the global system. What broadly does Biden represent for the world system?
Well, we're going to find out. I think that the question that's posed is how does Biden, and let's say that Biden's shorthand for the establishment and for the institutions, how do they address the situation in front of them? What problems do they have? One of the main problems that they have is that 2016, in the form of Trump and of Brexit, brought about a level of political disruption that spanned from Europe through the UK and into the United States. So they'll want to attempt to realign themselves on an institutional basis across the West. James Forsyth, who people should actually read, you don't agree with him politically, but a lot of his sources are quite interesting. And that, I think, is going to reflect itself, that attitude of rebuilding some kind of coherence is going to reflect itself within the Johnson cabinet and within his approach to governing, which we'll come on to talk about. And they also have to address other big questions around where does quote unquote populism go. What can they offer that can attempt to bring about, as I say, cohesion, not just among the institutions and among elites, but in the population as a whole. And that's where I think their problem is, because if you look at the big challenges, and that's not just the pandemic, but all of the things that flow from the pandemic and which predate, in fact, the virus as well. The question of unemployment, of the economy, of a society riven with social inequality, of the question of climate change, all of these big questions, which I think they are not well equipped to answer. So what they're going to attempt to do is to kind of knit together parts of the establishment that have fallen into various forms of disarray, and I think we'll see that. Happen. What I would say, just in closing though, just a caveat, is that this can be overstated. I think Biden is going to have an impact on the framework of how Europe and the UK and others interact. And we'll talk about the impact on Brexit, for example. But I think it can be overstated as well. I think they face huge challenges. I think they face all kinds of divisions, and it's not going to be plain sailing whatsoever.
You said before that there's a gulf between the institutional power that figures like Biden can wield, a gulf between that and real substantial public support, that whilst it is obviously the case that Joe Biden will use the traditional institutions of US power, from the Pentagon to NATO to various trade agreements to its friendship with the European Union, to re-establish a degree of stability in the Western world order. That doesn't necessarily reach into deeper layers in society. There isn't a popular project around Biden and the American population. Indeed, beyond getting rid of Trump, nobody really knows what Biden is about, and nobody has a great deal of buy-in into that project. And I think, as you said, that's an important qualification, because in the last few days, I mean, I was watching even something like Channel 4 News. You think of these, BBC, Channel 4 and so on, as being relatively removed from the ideological fray, at least that's their claim. But even on mainstream news programs, people are saying this is the end of populism. The traditional powers of Western civilization are reimposing themselves. We're getting back on track, all this kind of stuff. It's highly ideological. And media workers are often very profoundly ideologically attached to establishment institutions, regardless of what they say about that. And that was being directly linked in this Channel 4 News report to Dominic Cummings leaving number 10. The impression of the package was very much Biden's in, Cummings out. This obviously means that the Brexit deal is getting watered down, etc., etc. And while I think that speaks to real dynamics in a way, I don't think it's totally, coincidental that this fight inside number 10 happened after it became clear that Biden would be the president. I don't think it's completely coincidental, but I think it's very easy to read too directly into that situation. Would you agree?
I would agree. I think that Cummings has been attributed huge powers by lots of people in the kind of circles that you talk about, as if he can, in some Rasputin-like way, overcome the psychological abilities of everyone around him. Now, look, I'm not saying that Dominic Cummings isn't a formidable person or anything like that, but I think that this kind of analysis really stems from a mistake that was made in terms of how people viewed Brexit. And that's really in the following way. There was an assumption that for huge parts of capital within the UK, of huge parts of the establishment in the UK, that they were really wanting to pursue it very actively, serious disruption with the EU, serious rupture with the European institutions, and a no-deal Brexit. Now, we've been arguing the opposite of that, in fact, that far from there being even a split within the establishment, those who seriously wanted to push for leaving the EU without any kind of a trade deal were very much in the fringes of the British ruling class as a whole. And so what we see begin to happen, and again, this can be overstated because there's all kinds of contradictions, but what we see begin to happen is the question of Brexit starts to reach its limitations when it comes to the rhetoric around no deal. And I think that's partly why Dominic Cummings and other high-profile Leave supporters in and around Boris Johnson are becoming more and more alienated from the Johnson government. And so therefore, I think that when you add that together with Biden, who says that the United States will not carry out any kind of trade deal with the UK if there is any disruption to the Northern Ireland peace agreements, for example, then you start to build a picture here of what's going on. An attempt to recalibrate the pre-2016 transatlantic alliances. Now, it's important to just state here as well, is that far from the EU being a kind of counterweight to the power of the American state, and this is often put forward as a kind of rationale for why progressives might want to be supportive of the EU. I would argue that in fact the EU represents the convergence of transatlantic interests, primarily economic, but also political, also through NATO, and the interconnected nature of these institutions means that there is now quite a serious attempt to rebuild, and I keep using this word and keep coming back to it, to rebuild a sense of coherence. Now, I think there's problems with that. There's problems that will come, but I think that's what we are beginning to see. And on that basis, I do think we will see a trade agreement emerge. I think that's probably more likely than it has been at any point since Brexit. Despite the level of drama that you see around it, I think we'll probably see one or two more fairly dramatic moments, but I think eventually a trade deal will be arrived at. And of course, that will have implications for Scotland as well.
I think it's worth actually just briefly restating, what you're arguing there about the relationship between the British ruling elite and Brexit. As I recall, when on the morning that the Brexit vote actually won, of the FTSE 100 companies, the 100 biggest capitalist firms in Britain, the CEO of only one had supported leaving the European Union. 1% of the big capitalists in Britain. And that's probably a fairly accurate picture of the breakdown of the British establishment when it came to Brexit. The vast majority did not want it. And there's been a kind of conspiratorial view of why Brexit happened, that it was in the interests of a small but very aggressive section of British capitalism who wanted to turn Britain into a new Singapore or whatever. And there's an element of truth in that. Some ideologues who, in the ruling elite did have that vision for a kind of free trading British Empire 2.0 and so on. But they're extremely isolated and they're a very small element of the ruling elite. And then there were a handful of activists like Dominic Cummings, who also shared that vision. Actually, his political views are quite eccentric and sort of exotic, but there was almost an attitude that he was driving government and so on. I think that him being chucked out of government is an important reminder of the organic unity of the British ruling elite. The sense they have of their own interests as a class and as an establishment. And actually, you've had a lot of very triumphant conservatives, leading figures in the party in the last few days, basically saying exactly this. Remember that no one is bigger than the Conservative Party, because famously Dominic Cummings and his group around the Vote Leave campaign are very sort of anti the Conservative Party as such and see themselves as anti-establishment figures, though they're not really, of course. This is more a question of minor infighting within the ruling elite. But the message from the last few days has been, ultimately, the majority faction of British capitalism will reimpose precisely what it views as its interests when it comes to the crunch. And this, the idea that Boris Johnson is mini Trump, has been part of this view. And again, I strongly suspect that in the coming weeks, we're going to see that is very much not the case. His media outriders are already saying he's going to become more like the Boris Johnson of the London mayor, of the Liberal Tory, the One Nation Tory, and all this kind of stuff. Not that I think that those markers are particularly useful, actually. He's still going to be savagely anti-working class. But he is going to be in favour of returning Britain to its traditional position as a bridge across the Atlantic between the United States and Germany. Basically that has been a major part of Britain's role in the last, since the Second World War, and he wants to return Britain to that position. He probably always has. He was never willing to risk Britain's global position for an outlandish dream of Empire 2.0, this global trading nation, all this kind of stuff. And also we've seen in the last few weeks, interestingly, this pivot will come to Glasgow next year at COP26, where people around Johnson and Biden are saying this is going to be part of the great unveiling of the transatlantic comeback. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Another part of this is Boris Johnson is heading up something called the D10, the Democratic 10, which specifically carves out China and Russia, but draws India into the global club. India, of course, experiencing new friction with China. So there's a determined global realignment taking place here, of which Biden and Johnson are probably the leading actors. So this idea that a Biden administration is anti-Johnson, I think is also misunderstanding the situation. Biden is very happy to work with Johnson, and Johnson is very happy to work with Biden in this mutual project. This is the nature of the Conservative Party. It's a party of power, it's a party of empire, a party of imperialism, I should say, rather, to distinguish it from that idea of Empire 2.0. But it's very much a transatlantic party. It's very much interested in maintaining that, the global status quo, if you like.
Yeah, and it's important to recognise that. I mean, the Conservative Party is not a party who wants to actively pursue forms of disruption to the economy, to politics, to the institutions which they run and which they play a dominant role within. They don't want to disrupt these actors and these institutions. Far from it, in fact. And that's not to say that there hasn't been serious turmoil within them. There has been. The Conservative Party has suffered one of its most important, one of its deepest internal splits in many ways over the last few years. And I think that analysis of the Conservative Party also feeds into what Johnson might look to do next. Johnson being shorthand for leading Conservatives in the Conservative hierarchy. And that is that they also want to heal their own party internally. So getting Brexit out of the way, getting a trade deal, allows them to start to piece together once again the Conservative Party, so that the likes of Heseltine and John Major and the kind of tendency represented by those individuals within the Conservative Party come back into a degree of harmony with the likes of Boris Johnson and others in the Conservative Party. And that's what they're calling, they're using the word, that's what they're calling the Great Reset of the Boris Johnson government, that he will be pursuing big speeches and opportunities around, you've mentioned COP26, I believe this week he will be making a speech about green issues, for example. He'll be very much looking to see how the Paris Climate Accord that the US will now re-enter can play a role, not just when it comes to climate change. In fact, I think that's probably less on the agenda than the wider political realignments are. And that's obviously going to be reflected as well in things like the G10 that you talk about. That's a very interesting example where you see various states around the orbit of Western power come together, of course, carving out China. And there again, you'll see a convergence of interests. Again, those words which I think are going to become increasingly important, because we need to begin to understand how this is going to affect the political environment and how it's going to affect how the left can respond. My view is that, and I think this is something that we'll have to see whether it takes place or not. But I believe this can be a clarifying moment for the left. It can be a moment in which the left can range itself against the likes of Emmanuel Macron and Joe Biden and Boris Johnson and these kinds of individuals and the interests which they represent. And just say that, when we talk about the British ruling class, you use the word organic there, and I think it's just worth just unpacking that, because we're not saying that there's a big table around which the leading chief executives sit and they deliberate their strategy and that sort of thing. What we're saying is that they operate in a tightly organised, a highly integrated, a highly interdependent economic infrastructure, and it's through that infrastructure that political decisions are arrived at. So when you come to something like Brexit, for example, it doesn't mean that everyone has to sit around and say, well, this is our position, we want a trade deal. It's just that the trade deal itself, getting a deal with Europe, rebuilding a degree of harmony between the EU, the UK, and the United States, suits the interests of capital, suits free markets, and that sort of thing. And that's, I think, worth saying, because I think we're going to see more of that. Where there's going to be an issue, I think, and I'll throw this back to you, David, is that can they build a vision that's going to inspire the population to come together behind the state, behind Boris Johnson, whoever it might be? And that's where I think they've got a real problem, because I don't think they have the solutions. Well, we know they don't have the solutions to the manifold crises which people face. And then I think, again, to repeat, is where the left can come in. We have to come in and say, we have the solutions to these questions. We are going to counterpose ourselves to the institutions and to the ideas that have got us into this mess in the first place. And that, I think, can have great political consequences moving forward.
I agree, because what recent years have shown us is that that organic unity that we are discussing, the performance of society which is structured around the interests of the largest section of the business class in any given period. And you're right, it's not something which has to be conspiratorially attended to. The whole structure. I mean, this conversation was partly preceded by reading about among civil servants in Whitehall, right? So among parts of the British state which are permanent and not, democratically elected, the thousands of civil servants who work in the British state, an attitude of, BBV, it was called, had started to circulate. They were saying,
that's right,
get Brexit done, presumably with a deal. Biden comes in, we get a vaccine, we've got a road back to stability for the status quo, right? Which is interesting in itself, because it tells you that the ruling elite and the people who do the work of the ruling elite in reproducing the state and its various functions are constantly worried about political dissent. Even as in a period right now where there aren't huge movements on the streets and strike waves and so on, they're constantly thinking about this. They're constantly thinking things can go very wrong. And that's because institutions like the state have a long memory. They remember the big strikes in the 70s and the 80s. They remember the 60s. They remember the anti-war movement. They've seen Black Lives Matter just a few months ago. They know that huge movements can emerge very quickly. They are angry about the disruption that Brexit has caused over the last few years, and they know fine well that it's a reflection of public animosity towards the powerful. Now, the danger of the left not creating an alternative platform is that you get a return of the so-called populist right, or the far right, which honestly, even though it looks like it's on its knees at the moment, it has taken a beating in the last couple of years, it's certainly not out. I mean, Nigel Farage saying that he is going to start a new party, and at the moment he's saying it's going to be an anti-lockdown party, right? But he changes his mood on a regular basis, right? If lockdown becomes less of an issue, and this is a big if because of, say, the vaccines, for example, he will pivot onto other issues. And I wouldn't assume that forces like that cannot refashion themselves as the kind of de facto opposition. In a country where Starmer and Johnson are basically singing from the same hymn sheet, there is an opening for an official opposition. And we shouldn't imagine that if the left can't present an alternative platform, that someone from the right won't do it. That can easily happen. This is why I think it's important to measure this idea of like the return of the centre. I think that's a real process. I think there's real effort going into that. I think they've got an opening and they're aware of it, which is why so many, mainstream journalists are cock-a-hoop about this situation. But I think that the fundamental material basis for what people have called populism, for like far right or nationalist creeds, the material basis for that is still all there. There's very little support for the ruling elite. There's widespread anger about the continuing effects of austerity, about the recession, about misgovernment, misrule, all kinds of things, right? And the right can come back in on that. Just in connection with that, and lastly, I want to focus in on Scotland, because my feeling is this is where something has gone wrong with the leadership, at least, of the Scottish independence movement. In 2014, you had a mass broad, I mean, it was politically broad, but its strongest sections, I would argue, were centre-left, left of centre, and further left of that in the independence movement in 2014 that set the political agenda. And the discussion in 2014 was not about immigration or national identity or these kinds of questions. It very firmly became about austerity, foreign policy, nuclear weapons, how society's resources are allocated, how democratic decisions are made. But in recent years, the leadership of the SNP is increasingly sought to align itself with this idea of the return of the centre, with this idea that, I mean, the leadership of the SNP is every inch kind of transatlantic, Clintonite. We represent the international community here in Scotland and all this kind of stuff. Incidentally, there was a very good interview by Leslie Riddick with Ian Blackford, the Westminster leader of the SNP, where Blackford consistently said the most important thing is getting the international community on side. And he's saying that with an eye to the Biden situation and so on. I mean, haven't these people worked themselves into a real corner here where Biden wants a friendship with Johnson? It's important to his presidency that a link is re-established between the United States and Europe, that those relations having been damaged by Trump. That is presumably going to be more important to Biden than some small breakaway state, in Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, everything you say there is important, and I think we'll do a separate video that will just be focused on everything that we've talked about so far, but relating it to the Scottish situation directly and specifically. So I'll just end by just making one or two comments that might tee that up. Even well before Biden, Brexit was seen as an opportunity for the SNP leadership to build alliances with the European Union. Now, look, my view is that you could argue that was done as a means to build support for independence. I think it's much more complex than that. I actually think it has to do far more with the world view of the SNP leadership and of Nicola Sturgeon and Ian Blackford and people like that in particular. And that is that they also don't want any disruption to how the world system operates. They don't want any disruption to how they might relate to both the European Union and the United States. You could argue that that's for practical reasons and pragmatic reasons. I argue, though, and I know we both have argued, that it's much more ideological than that. That is, in fact, their ideological disposition, that they see the European Union and Joe Biden and these kinds of, and the institutions associated with them, as being genuinely the progressive consensus which has to be rebuilt. Now, where does Scotland fit within that? Well, it draws all kinds of different problems. So if that's your attitude, then where does it leave you on the question of currency? Where does it leave you on the question of things like Trident when it comes to building your relationships with NATO? Where does it leave you on any number of questions where the independence movement wants to see real and fundamental change, real and fundamental shifts in how our society operates, when the leadership of that movement wants to become integrated as fast, as easy, and as smoothly as possible within the framework which we've outlined in our discussion so far. So I'll leave it at that, but we'll have a video which focuses explicitly on what's the role of the SNP within this emerging situation and the dynamics around it.
Okay, Jonathan, thanks very much for that. I look forward to that conversation. Can I ask people watching this to like the video, share it if you think it's an interesting conversation, subscribe to this YouTube channel so you get all our videos, and you can follow all the debates on this subject at contour.co.uk. And I look forward to speaking to you all again soon.